invite Mr. Teja. He is a research scholar. Which center? In CHS. And his topic is contested customs in the Naga Hills, Baptist reformers, salvage ethnography, and Naga customary law. Please.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor and privilege to present a paper to this distinguished audience, and I want to thank the Naga Scholars Association for this wonderful opportunity. My presentation is titled Contested Customs in the Naga Hills, Baptist Reformers, Salvage Ethnography, and Naga Customary Law. Dr. Imti has already touched on the conflicts and tensions which Christianity introduced within the Ao Nagas, and this paper examines three particular customs which were contested between the newly converts to Christianity and those who adhered to the traditional religion. And I argue that these cases represents the earliest recorded cases where customary law was debated within the Naga villages, and therefore they are crucial to obtain a historical perspective on Naga customary law. I begin with a case in 1934 recorded by Deputy Commissioner of Naga Hills J.H. Hutton during one of his annual tour to the Angami village of Konoma in 1934. A case was brought before to him where two young unmarried girls of the village who were recently converted to Baptist Christianity refused to shave their hair, which was required of all unmarried girls within the village. It was taboo among the Angami Nagas for unmarried girls to grow their hair, but these two young girls considered themselves Christians and therefore not bound to the antiquated heathen customs. They also refused to accept the decision of the village elders who prescribed the customary law, because the village elders followed the traditional religion and therefore they had no authority to impose the decision on the Christians. When the case was brought before the Deputy Commissioner J.H. Hutton was no stranger to this form of disputes. Throughout his years in office, he had handled and come across several cases like this, and he was particularly angered over the fact that a clean and seemly custom was being challenged by a few young girls who wanted to make themselves look pretty. And moreover, he considered it an immemorial custom, and therefore he wasn't willing to concede or surrender. And he delivered his order that the young girls, as long as they remain within the village, they must abide by the custom of the village. And if they want freedom from the custom, they might leave the village. They are free to leave the village. Hutton left the village the next day, satisfied with his order and convinced that St. Paul would be on his side. And the case alluded just now is among many such cases which attest to the deep-rooted animosity between the attitude of the ethnographers and the missionaries towards tribal customs in the Naga Hills. The Baptist missionaries preached the new religion in direct opposition to the traditional way of life. The Baptist was to be a new man in Christ in every sense of the word. The old customs belonged to the pagan past, smeared with savagery, barbarism, and heathenism. And the missionaries took upon themselves the duty to civilize the warlike Naga tribes into peace-loving citizens. The Baptist converts also began to identify their new status by actively rejecting the old way of life in dressing, food habits, and most controversially by refusing to observe village customs. In the missionary discourse, the old customs had to be abandoned or reformed to adapt to civilized way of living, and only then will the Nagas become a manly, worthy people. And the colonial ethnographers shared the opposite view. They did not mince words when they lamented the fact that Nagas were abandoning their authentic culture in substitution for an alien and superficial civilization. In fact, an anthropologist, Führer von Hermendorf, plainly stated that Nagas, in converting to Christianity, and I quote, says, cease to be a real Naga, close quote. And so there were two different and opposing discourse on tribal customs in the Naga Hills, which became very prominent by the beginning of the 20th century. The missionary discourse with its reformist zeal, and that of the ethnographers with the romantic veneration of the old customs. And this difference was brought out sharply in numerous court cases, commonly represented as Christian versus ancients, where the Baptist minority refused to observe the village customs or accept the decision of the traditional authorities. These conflicts are crucial to obtain a historical perspective of Naga customary law, for they represent the earliest recorded instances when the scope and nature of customary law was debated within the Naga villages. the colonial ethnographic discourse of custom. The early colonial reports on the Naga Hills are filled with reports of lawlessness and savagery among the warlike tribes, which necessitated the establishment of a civilized government. For instance, in 1866, the Lieutenant Governor of Bengal, discussing policies to be adopted in the Naga Hills, recommended a form of administration which could reclaim the Nagas from, quote, habits of lawlessness to those of order and civilization, close. And 10 years later, in 1876, the political agent of Naga Hills, Butler, he reported little progress, and I quote, "This is no word painting on my part, for I am here speaking of actual facts and a most deplorable state of affairs, which seems to have existed from time immemorial, and is to be seen in full force up to the present day, a fatal barrier to all moral progress. I must confess it is not a little disheartening to think how long and how arduously we have striven, and yet how little we have done towards improving, civilizing, and winning from the accursed thirst for blood the traditions of untold ages of anarchy and warfare." Close quote. In these accounts, there is little difference between the attitude of the colonial officers and the missionaries, because both desired to reform and civilize the Nagas. However, by the beginning of the 20th century, some colonial administrators began to question the project of civilizing the Naga tribes and the harm which such projects were inflicting on Naga culture. Administrators such as Hutton and Mills, who also took a very strong interest in the emerging discipline of anthropology, they began to express the need to protect primitive societies such as the Nagas from the harmful effects of contacts with civilization. Hutton called the state a civilized intruder, which, in finding primitive culture strange, uncouth, and repulsive, has started a policy of destruction in the belief that it is substituting higher and better ways. And lamenting the changes which has attended the administered areas of Naga Hills, Hutton romanticizes the tribes which remain outside the administered area, and I quote, "No paternal government forbids them from taking off heads or their fetus to survive, and no profane hand is raised against their customs of primeval antiquity." Close quote. J.P. Mills, a contemporary, also expressed similar sentiments which almost appeared like a nostalgic celebration of headhunting, and I quote, "There is a beneficial side to headhunting which is often forgotten. It is not one of the worst horrors of the world." Mills also states that the prohibition on headhunting has led to a very real loss in virility and keenness. These writings represented a significant departure from the earlier colonial accounts in that there was an element of romanticizing and essentializing of Naga customs and traditions. Tribal customs and traditions, which were initially shunned as barbaric and uncivilized, were now venerated and celebrated as the age-old, time-honored customs which needed to be preserved. These customs were identified to be the authentic Naga culture, and in the colonial discourse, they were the repositories of customary law. And the colonial rule now professed a new mission. The civilizing mission was now replaced by a new mission to protect the Nagas from civilization. And John Thomas observed this romantic impulse as the tendency to freeze the culture and religion of the colonized and reduce them to museum pieces. And administrators and ethnographers of this romantic vein impressed upon themselves the duty to protect and preserve tribal culture. And this paper explores the context in which the voices of romanticism emerged in the Naga Hills and the implications it had on the colonial state as well as Naga customary law. Now for missionary discourse of custom. Mary Clark, the wife of Reverend E.W. Clark, described her first entry into Naga Hills as, I quote, "a plunge into barbarism after bidding goodbye to civilization." Close quote. In the missionary discourse, conversion entailed a new way of life, a life totally distinct from the old life. Christianity represented converts were to embody this new life by rejecting the past. In the Naga Hills, this meant complete rejection of the customs and traditions associated with the savage past. The missionaries' attitudes towards custom in the Naga Hills is perhaps best summed up by Mary Clark in her dismissal of the Morongs. The Morongs were celebrated by the ethnographers as the most important institution within the village, and Mary Clark describes the Morong in this manner: "the unmistakable evidences of an uncivilized and barbarous people." It was the growing minority of Baptists who first challenged the authority of customs and sought to reform the heathenish and barbaric customs. The early Baptists demanded the liberty of conscience in asserting their right to profess a new religion whereby the limited jurisdiction of the old customs was explicitly argued. It was their demand to secure freedom of religious belief which challenged the legality of customary practices. And viewed against the romanticism of the administrator ethnographers, the Baptist missionaries represented ideals of individualism, religious freedom, separation of religion and state, which are classic strands of enlightenment. And the historiography on the Christianization of Naga Hills has been very varied. It received early attention from the colonial ethnographers like Hutton Mills, Hemendo, and later Ver Elwin. And it's a very similar opinion which they shared. The Naga culture, Nagas are represented as passive observers whose culture has been replaced and reformed by an alien culture and alien religion. And I think recent Naga scholar Tezen Lot Thong has also somehow restated such argument more recently. There are other scholars like Richard Eaton and Ketoleno Mefo who have attempted to study Christianization of Nagas from the perspectives of the natives themselves. So for Richard Eaton, it is Nagas responding to a shift in their cosmological worldview, and for Ketoleno, it's Nagas attempting to fashion a new identity of self. However, I think that the historiography on Christianization of Naga Hills has so far yet to explore some of these numerous court cases which are available in the state archives and the implications which these cases have on an understanding of Naga customary law. In a very significant study, John Thomas has shown the deep-rooted impact of missionary history and how this missionary history has defined the Naga Christians' understanding of history. So according to this missionary history, the pre-Christian past is relegated to a period of darkness, as mentioned before by Dr. E.T. as well. A period of darkness which is governed by heathen and barbaric practices, and therefore history practically begins with the arrival of Christianity. And in this paper I attempt to explore the impact of this missionary history in the conflicts which is generated, particularly with regard to customs. In a more recent work, even Kekhali has noted the conflict between the colonial ethnographers and the Baptist missionaries in casting their own ideologies upon the Nagas. And these contestations argue that they generated two different and opposing discourse on tribal customs. One is the reformism of the missionaries, the other romanticism of the ethnographers. And I argue that the basis on which these customs were contested and the transformative process to which customs were subjected are crucial for understanding the contradictions and the ambivalences within Naga customary law. The first case is regard to Mithan sacrifice. Mithan is more popularly known as Mithun among the Nagas, but I retained the colonial term Mithan in this paper. One of the earliest attacks on established custom by the missionaries was with regard to the Au custom of killing Mithan. Ethnographers like Smith and Mills have noted that the Aus killed Mithan in a very gruesome manner for the performance of death rites or in the celebration of the Feast of Merit. So Reverend W. Clark has actually sent several petitions requesting the government to abolish this custom of Mithan sacrifice during feasts and festivals. And the grounds which he cited were this: 1. Infliction of inhuman torture on a quiet and inoffensive animal, that it had a barbarizing influence, that there was a lot of drunkenness and enormous waste of food supplies, and that it was a serious and a needless obstacle in the way of the spread of education. Taking note of these petitions, the Deputy Commissioner of Naga Hills ordered the subdivisional officer of Colloqium to inform all our villages in 1890 about the displeasure of the government against the killing of Mithan by torture, and warned them of a fine if such cases were reported. However, the custom itself was not abolished, as the SDO informed. They were not forbidden to kill Mithans, yet they must kill them in a way more human than hitherto practiced. And Clark was very dissatisfied with the government's order, and in his subsequent petition he writes, and I quote, "I was speaking the other day to one of the more intelligent Molong villagers about your decision not to prohibit Mithan killing, but to stop the cruelties. He was a good deal surprised and not a little disappointed that the reign of the English was not proving as beneficent as he had expected. This was his own idea, I did not suggest it to him. I think the general expectation was that soon after annexation, it would be abolished on the ground that it was too bad and evil to be tolerated by a benign government. For Clark, the abolition of this inhuman custom was crucial to the project of reforming the Aus into civilized people. And it is interesting that Clark appealed to the civilized sensibilities of the colonial administration, because he believed that even the colonial administration shared his zeal to reform the tribes into a civilized life. And no doubt the early colonial officers did. But here we see the beginning of a rivalry, of a tension which is emerging between the colonial administration and the missionaries. Mr. Davis, the SDO of Colloqium, he made a detailed assessment on the subject of Mithan killing and dismissed all objections raised by Clark, stating this as his reason. And I quote, "The custom of Mithan killing is a custom that is held in great respect by the Aus, and to suppress a time-honored custom of this sort would be such an interference with the people as we have not thought right to use in the case of any other Naga tribe." Here was the beginning of an attack on anything traditional and customary. For to be a Christian was to throw away every vestige of the old religion. And no wonder Mary Clark anticipated opposition from adherents of the old cruel faith, who were quick to see that the gospel of peace and love would put to rout most of the old customs handed down from the forefathers for whom they held the greatest reverence. When the colonial state did not favor the appeal for reform, the Baptists demanded their right to abstain from the observance of this custom, and the missionaries were actively engaged in petitioning the government to secure true justice and liberty for the converted Christians. And by religious liberty, they meant the complete exemption from all obligations to the religious customs of the heathens. And the demand for religious liberty set new grounds of conflict, where customs had to be assigned into a separate religious and secular sphere. And while the colonial state responded to the petitions against Mithan sacrifice with a professed commitment of non-interference, the demand for religious liberty would soon force them to change their policy. Their interference was rendered necessary because of the uncomfortable question of religious liberty, an issue which was sensitive to their own liberal values. The next custom which was contested between the newly converts to Baptist Christianity and the people who adhered to the traditional religion was with regard to the Au custom of Akse. Akse is the Au custom of levying a tax to meet the expenses of the village when they host guests from other villages, or when they organize feasts and other rituals to propitiate spirits. And the missionaries had sent several petitions to the government to free the Christians from the payment of this customary subscription. But the order of the government, which I quote, "It would be unfair on all other Nagas to abolish and approve of and recognize custom of theirs only for the sake of a handful of Christians." Plus, the Chief Commissioner of Assam also gave his decision in this manner. "It would be impolite to abolish an ancient custom to which the people appear to be attached, or to exempt the Au Naga Christians residing in village where the custom is in force." Close. Interestingly, in 1905, the then Deputy Commissioner of Naga Hills, W.J. Reid, he granted the Christians the right to abstain from the payment of Akse, and his ruling is worth quoting. I quote his ruling: "We cannot, in common justice, compel Christians to contribute to the maintenance of a superstitious belief which they have been taught to discard, and it must be understood throughout the subdivision that in religious matters every man is free to contribute or to refrain from contributing as may seem right to him." Reid's order was also titled "On the Rights and Liberties of Our Christians." However, this ruling was revoked in 1908, and Christians were compelled again to pay the customary subscription. The last custom which was contested was with regard to Jena observance. Jena is an Assamese word which is used to connote a combination of meanings, but generally it refers to rest days observed by people who still followed the traditional religion, similar to the Christian Sabbath. And the Baptists refused to observe the Jena days not only because of the rituals associated with it, but also because they had their own Sabbats to observe, and it was impractical for them to waste working days in observing all the Jenas. And the most common solution was to ask the Christians to move outside the village and form their own village. But in cases where the newly converts refused to leave the village, they would come to an agreement where the ancient was the term which was used for people who followed the traditional religion. They would come up with a list of the most important jenas throughout the year, which the Christians were then compelled to observe. However, in most cases, even these the Christians were not willing to observe, and in most of the villages where Christianity was introduced, Christians always formed a new village. For my conclusion, the Baptist Christians introduced a new way in which customary practices were interpreted. They were interpreted from the perspective of a new Christian morality, which initially had little sympathy for anything traditional. Baptist Christianity undermined the very basis of traditional social institutions and challenged the authority of the community over the individual. These cases problematizes the understanding of Naga customary law as an unchanging entity passed down since the pre-colonial times. Christianity represented an unmistakable break when the validity and the sacrosanctity of the existing customs were directly challenged. The custom of meat and sacrifice was stripped of its alleged barbarities. An attempt was made to demarcate Aksa into the religious and the secular, while jenas were given a certain rationality and fixity. For the emergent Christian community, these customs were reminders of the sinful past when they lived in darkness, and therefore ought to be abandoned altogether. Even when the state compelled them to observe certain customs, the meaning and context in which these customs were observed had radically changed.
Thank you, Mr. Kogan. Thank you so much.